They slaughtered his son for sport. Now he's inside their war room. Part 5. The Reckoning. The alarms tore through the fortress like a living thing, bouncing off walls and flooding every corridor with a sharp red light that turned the shadows into something alive and moving. Soldiers began running. Doors sealed. Communication channels exploded with overlapping voices, shouting orders and questions and demands that no one had answers for. Darwin stood in the center of the war room and watched the chaos begin on the screens around him. The data was already out there, spreading across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, impossible to contain, impossible to take back. Every file, every record, every ugly truth the Valari had buried inside this fortress was now playing on screens in homes and government buildings and military command centers on 1,000 different worlds. The Valari were being watched, and for the first time in their history, they did not control what the audience saw. He released the neural spike. Dokkan's body unlocked. The commander stumbled forward 2 steps, caught himself, and turned to face Darwin with a rage that twisted his scaled features into something barely controlled. His forearms flexed. His clawed hands opened and closed. "You stupid creature," Dokkan said. His voice was low and shaking. "What do you think you have done? You have released files, data, words on screens. My fleet is still the largest in this region. My soldiers still hold every system we have taken. Your republic does not have the will to fight us. They never have. They write their condemnations and hold their votes and do nothing. They will do nothing now." Darwin looked at him calmly. "You think this is about your fleet? What else is there?" Darwin pointed to one of the screens. It showed a broadcast from a neutral world, a species called the Mareni, tall and quiet beings who had traded with the Valari for decades. The Mareni ambassador was standing at a podium, and even without sound, the expression on his face was clear. He was reading from the leaked files. Behind him, a screen displayed the Valari's population catalog, and on that catalog, highlighted in cold text, was the Mareni homeworld, flagged as a future target for hunt captures. The Mareni had not known. Now, they did. "Your allies," Darwin said. "Your trade partners. Every species that shook your hand and looked the other way because they thought they were safe. They just found out they were on your list." Dokkan's jaw tightened. He looked at the screen, and for the first time since Darwin had met him, something other than arrogance crossed his face. The war room doors burst open. A squad of Valari soldiers poured into the room, weapons raised, moving in the fast, disciplined formation of trained killers. They saw Dokkan. They saw Darwin, a human standing in the most secure room in their empire, without disguise, without fear. The squad leader froze for half a second, because the situation did not match anything he had been trained for. Darwin raised his hands. He did not run. He did not fight. He simply stood there and said, "Check your communication channels." The squad leader hesitated, then touched the device on his wrist. His face changed. Outside the fortress, the galaxy was responding to the broadcast faster than anyone had predicted. The Mareni had already severed diplomatic ties with the Valari, and were recalling their trade ships. 3 other neutral species had done the same, within the hour. The Republic, the same Republic that had written polite condemnations for years and done nothing else, was holding an emergency session, and the early reports said the vote was going one way. Not sanctions, not statements, a military blockade. Jisoo had done more than just broadcast the files. In the weeks before the mission, she had quietly leaked the Valari fleet's patrol routes and defensive positions to Republic military intelligence through channels that could not be traced. The Republic's admirals had been studying those routes for days. They had been positioning ships. They had been waiting for a reason to move. Now they had one. Deep in the fortress, Darwin's earpiece crackled. Jisoo's voice came through, tight and fast. "Byul and I are at the ship. Hanul has the engines running. You need to move now. The docking bay is going to lock down in 8 minutes. Dowan looked at Dokkan one last time. The commander stood, surrounded by his own soldiers, in his own war room, and he looked like a creature who was only just beginning to understand that the ground beneath his feet had moved. "Why?" Dokkan asked. The arrogance was gone from his voice now. There was only confusion, the deep, genuine confusion of someone who could not understand why a single human would risk everything for something as small, in his mind, as one death. He was one prey, one hunt. We have taken thousands. Why would you do all of this for one? Dowan looked at him with an expression that Dokkan would never understand, not because it was complicated, but because it required something the Valari had never possessed. "Because he was mine," Dowan said. He turned and walked out of the war room. The soldiers did not stop him. They were too busy receiving new orders. The fortress was going to full alert. The fleet was mobilizing. The command structure was scrambling to respond to a crisis that had appeared from nowhere and grown faster than they could contain. One human walking through a corridor was the smallest of their problems now. Dowan moved through the fortress the way he had entered it, quietly, steadily, like a man who had already accepted every possible outcome and found peace with all of them. The neural cloak was back on. He was invisible again. Corridors that had been calm and orderly hours ago were now filled with running soldiers and shouting officers. Nobody looked at him twice. He reached the docking bay with 2 minutes to spare. Hanul had the Sungyun powered up and hovering just above the deck, the cargo ramp open and waiting. Biol stood at the top of the ramp with a rifle in her hands and a look on her face that said she was ready to fight every soldier in the fortress if she had to. Jisoo was already inside, her screens glowing, her fingers moving across controls as she monitored the Valari communications in real time. Dowan walked up the ramp. Biol grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. The ramp closed. Hanul hit the throttle, and the Sungyun shot out of the docking bay like a stone from a sling, diving into the gap between two patrol ships before they could react. The Valari fired. Energy blasts streaked past the ship's hull, close enough to shake the walls. Hanul flew the way he always flew, like a man who had made peace with the idea of dying a long time ago and had decided it was not going to happen today. He cut between the patrol ships, dropped below the fortress's weapon range, and accelerated toward the edge of the system, where the Republic blockade was already forming, a wall of warships that stretched across the void like a line drawn in the dark. The Sungyun crossed that line. The Republic fleet closed behind them. The Valari patrol ships pulled back. For the first time in memory, the Valari were on the other side of a border they did not control. Inside the ship, it was quiet. Jisoo monitored the feeds. Biol put the rifle down and began checking Dowan for injuries he had not noticed. Hanul sat in the pilot's seat and stared straight ahead with both hands on the controls, breathing slowly. Dowan sat alone in the cargo hold. The bag he had carried from his home on the colony was at his feet. Inside it, beneath the neural cloak suit and the equipment, was a small photograph that Yuna had slipped in before he left. It showed Taeho, at 12 years old, standing in the field behind their house, smiling at the camera, with dirt on his face and grass in his hair. Dowan held the photograph and looked at it for a long time. The galaxy was changing outside. The broadcasts were still playing. Worlds were cutting ties with the Valari. Fleets were moving. Votes were being cast. The hunts would end. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The Valari had built their power on the idea that no one was watching. Now, everyone was watching. And the things that live in darkness do not survive the light. None of it would bring Taeho home. Dowan knew that. He had known it from the moment he opened the case beneath his floor and put on the suit. He had not done this to undo what had been done. He had done it so that no other father, on any world, would ever sit in a dark room and watch his child die on a screen for the entertainment of monsters. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he put it back in the bag, closed his eyes, and let the silence of the ship carry him forward into whatever came next. The war was not over, but the door was open, and the Valari, for the first time in their empire's long and bloody history, were the ones standing in the arena, surrounded, exposed, and afraid, while the rest of the galaxy watched. H1. They slaughtered his son for sport. Now he's inside their war room. H1. Part 4. The Unraveling. Dowan waited 3 more days. He watched Dokkan move through the fortress the way a hunter watches an animal return to the same watering hole. Noting the pattern, the timing, the moments when the target was most relaxed and least aware. Dokkan was a creature of habit. Every evening, after the summit events ended, he walked the same route back to his private quarters. He always dismissed his guards at the entrance to the officers' corridor, because he believed the fortress itself was all the protection he needed. He always walked the last stretch alone. On the 4th night, Dowan was waiting in that corridor. The lights were dim. The corridor was long and narrow, with no windows and no cameras. Jisoo had confirmed that. Valari officers valued their privacy and had insisted that the personal quarters section remain unmonitored. It was a small vanity. It was the kind of mistake that only people who had never been hunted would make. Dokkan walked around the corner and stopped. Dowan stood in the middle of the corridor, still wearing the neural cloak, still looking like a Valari trade delegate. Dokkan frowned at him, the way a powerful man frowns at someone who is standing where they should not be. "You are in the wrong section," Dokkan said. His voice was deep and carried the casual authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "Trade delegates are on level 42. Leave." Dowan did not move. He reached up to his neck and pressed the small switch behind his ear. The neural cloak shimmered and then dissolved, peeling away from his body like fog burning off in sunlight. The Valari skin faded. The extra arms disappeared. The cracked glass eyes were replaced by human ones, dark and steady and utterly calm. Dokkan stared. His forearms tensed. His eyes widened with something that was not quite fear, because Dokkan had never feared anything, but something close, the sharp sudden surprise of seeing something that should not exist in a place where it should not be. "Human," he said. "My name is Dowan," Dowan said. "6 weeks ago, you approved a hunt on the Frontier Colony broadcast. A young human male, 22 years old, black hair, torn jacket. He threw a rock at one of your hunters and hit him in the jaw." Dokkan tilted his head. The surprise on his face faded and was replaced by something else. Amusement. A slow smile spread across his scaled face, showing rows of sharp teeth. "I approve many hunts," he said. "You expect me to remember one prey animal among thousands? He was my son." Dokkan's smile did not fade. If anything, it grew wider. "Ah," he said softly, as if he had just tasted something pleasant. "The father. I have heard stories about human parents. They say you form strong bonds with your young, stronger than most species. It must be very painful for you." He said the word painful, the way someone might describe an interesting flavor. Dowan's hand moved. It was fast, faster than Dokkan expected. A small device, no bigger than a coin, pressed against the side of the commander's neck, just below his skull. Dokkan flinched and reached up to grab Dowan's wrist, but his forearm stopped halfway. His fingers twitched. His eyes went wide. His jaw opened, but no sound came out. The neural spike was a piece of technology that the Republic had developed, and then immediately classified as illegal. It connected to the target's nervous system through the skin and allowed the operator to override voluntary motor function. The target could still think. They could still feel. They could still see and hear everything, but their body no longer belonged to them. Dokkan stood perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his face frozen in an expression of confused rage. "Walk," Dowan said. Dokkan's body turned and began walking. His legs moved smoothly, his posture was natural, and anyone watching from a distance would see a Valari commander taking a late-evening walk through the fortress with a companion. Dowan reactivated the neural cloak and fell into step beside him. They walked through the corridors in silence, past guards who saluted Dokkan without a second glance, past officers who nodded respectfully and kept moving, past cleaning crews and maintenance workers and night shift technicians who had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. They reached the war room corridor. The 8 guards stationed at the entrance straightened when they saw Dokkan approaching. The lead guard stepped forward. "Commander, we were not expecting you tonight." Dowan sent a small signal through the spike. Dokkan's mouth opened, and words came out. His own voice, his own tone, controlled by someone else's will. "Unscheduled review," Dokkan said. "I will be brief." The guards stepped aside. They walked to the gene-locked door. Dowan guided Dokkan's hand to the scanning panel. The panel lit up. It read the commander's DNA. The lock clicked. The door opened. Dowan stepped inside the war room, and for a moment he stood still and looked at what the Valari had built. The room was enormous. It stretched out in every direction like a cathedral, with a high ceiling covered in hollow projectors that displayed a real-time map of Valari space. Below the map, dozens of workstations sat in rows, each one covered in screens showing data, reports, and communications. The walls were lined with larger displays, and on those displays were the things that Dowan had come to find. Hunt schedules, colony raid timetables, population catalogs of species that had been marked for capture, breeding projections for species that the Valari had decided to farm rather than hunt to extinction, keeping the numbers sustainable so the entertainment would never end. Viewer ratings for past hunts, broken down by species, age, and how long the prey had survived. There were graphs, there were charts, there were neatly organized files that turned the murder of living beings into data points on a spreadsheet. Dowan walked through the room slowly. He found Tejo's file. It was short. Capture date, transport ID, arena assignment, duration of hunt, 14 minutes, cause of death, ceremonial blade, thorax penetration. Viewer rating, 8.7 out of 10. A note at the bottom said the footage had been selected for the season's highlight package. His son's death had been rated like a performance. Dowan stood very still, for a long time. He pressed them flat against the console and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then, he got to work. He inserted a data card into the central console and began copying everything. Every file, every record, every schedule, every communication between commanders about which worlds to raid next, and how many captives to take. He copied the population catalogs and the breeding projections and the viewer ratings. He copied the financial records that showed how much money the hunts generated. He copied the internal memos where officers discussed which species made for the best entertainment. When the card was full, he connected it to the signal relay that Biol had planted in the war room's communication array during their second day on the fortress. The relay linked to Jisu's network. Jisu was waiting. Dowan opened a channel. Send it. Jisu sent it. Not to one place, not to 10 places, to everywhere. She pushed the data through every open channel, every Republic relay, every neutral broadcast network, every independent newsfeed she could reach. She amplified the signal using the Valari's own communication array. turning the fortress into a transmitter that broadcast the truth about the hunts to every corner of known space. Within minutes, the data was spreading faster than anyone could stop it. Worlds that had turned a blind eye to the hunts were now staring directly at the evidence. Neutral species that had traded with the Valari were now reading internal memos that described their own populations as potential future targets. Allied worlds were seeing financial records that proved the hunts were not just entertainment, but a core part of the Valari economy. Behind Dowan, Dokkan stood frozen where he had been left. They were fixed on Dowan with a fury so deep it seemed to burn, and even though his body could not move, his expression said everything. Dowan looked back at him. "Now they all see what you are," he said quietly. "Every world, every species, every eye in the galaxy, they see you." An alarm screamed to life somewhere deep in the fortress. Red light flooded the corridor outside the war room door. The broadcast had been detected. The Valari knew. They slaughtered his son for sport. Now he's inside their war room. Part 3. The Mask. The stolen merchant vessel was called the Sungyan, and it was an ugly ship. It was wide and flat and slow, and looked like it had been dragged through an asteroid field more than once. But that was the point. Valari merchant ships were not supposed to look impressive. They were supposed to look like they belonged, and the Sungyan looked exactly like 1,000 other trade vessels that drifted in and out of Valari space every day. Hanel flew it with the calm, steady hand of someone who had been dodging patrols since he was old enough to reach the controls. They crossed into Valari territory at a point where 2 patrol routes overlapped in a way that created a blind window of exactly 11 minutes. Hanel hit the window perfectly, not a second early, not a second late. Inside the ship, Dowan stood in the small cargo hold and put on the neural cloak suit for the first time in 12 years. The suit was thin and black, and it fit against his skin like water. When he activated it, the material hummed softly and then went still. A holographic layer spread across his body, scaling his skin, reshaping his silhouette, adding 2 extra arms that moved when he moved and felt as real as his own. He looked down at his hands and saw clawed Valari fingers. He turned to the small mirror on the wall and saw a Valari face staring back at him with cracked glass eyes and a jaw full of sharp teeth. It was a perfect disguise. The neural cloak did not just change how he looked. It changed his biosigns, his heat signature, even the way he smelled. To any scanner, any guard, any creature standing right next to him, he was Valari. The technology had been developed by the Republic's Black Ops division for deep infiltration missions. Only a handful of suits had ever been made, and most of them had been destroyed when the program was shut down. Dowan had kept his. He was not sure why at the time. Now he knew. Jisoo had built their cover identity perfectly. According to the forged documents, they were a minor trade delegation from a border world, arriving at the summit to negotiate shipping contracts. It was boring and unremarkable, which was exactly what they needed. Nobody paid attention to boring people. The fortress appeared on their screens 2 hours before they reached it, and even Dowan, who had seen many terrible and impressive things in his life, felt something tighten in his chest at the sight of it. It was enormous, a dark structure that hung in orbit like a mountain torn from a planet and set floating among the stars. Weapon platforms jutted from its surface in every direction. Patrol ships circled it in tight formations. Lights glowed from thousands of windows, and at its center, visible even from this distance, was a tower that rose above everything else like a spine. That was where the war room was. That was where they needed to go. They docked without trouble. The port authorities scanned their credentials and waved them through. A bored-looking Valari officer glanced at their cargo manifest and told them their assigned quarters were on level 42. Hanuel stayed with the ship. Byul, Jisoo, and Dawan walked into the fortress. The inside was worse than Dawan had imagined. The corridors were wide and tall, and decorated with trophies from 100 conquered worlds, bones mounted in glass cases, weapons taken from defeated enemies, and holoscreens that played highlights from past hunts on a loop. Dawan walked past a screen showing a group of captured aliens running through a jungle arena while Valari hunters tracked them from above. The crowd in the footage was cheering. Somewhere in this fortress, someone had approved that hunt. Someone had signed off on it the way a normal person might approve a budget report. He kept walking. He kept his face blank and his movements smooth. The neural cloak handled the physical disguise, but the behavior was all him. He had to walk like a Valari, stand like a Valari, carry himself with the lazy confidence of a species that believed it sat at the top of the food chain. It was not difficult. He had pretended to be worse things. The summit was held in a massive hall near the top of the fortress. Delegations from a dozen species mingled and talked and drank a dark liquid that Dawan did not touch. The Valari hosts moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting compliments and making deals and laughing at jokes that Dawan suspected were told at the expense of whatever species was not in the room. Dawan listened. He memorized faces and names and ranks the way he had been trained to do, quickly, quietly, with a memory that held details the way a net holds fish. He identified 14 high-ranking Valari officials, 6 military commanders, and 3 members of the ruling council. He noted where they stood, who they talked to, and what they said when they thought nobody important was listening. He heard them talk about the hunts, the way businessmen talked about quarterly reports. Numbers, targets, ratings. One commander mentioned that the next hunt cycle was expected to draw record viewership because they had captured a batch of particularly strong specimens from a newly discovered colony world. Another laughed and said the audience preferred the ones who fought back because it made for better footage. Dawan's hands tightened at his sides, but his face did not change. The mask held. While Dawan moved through the summit, Byul worked in the background. She had hidden the signal relays inside decorative items that she offered as gifts to the Valari hosts. Small carved boxes and polished stones that contained transmitters no bigger than a grain of sand. The Valari accepted them without suspicion. Why would they suspect anything? They were the most powerful species in the region. No one would dare move against them. No one would be stupid enough to try. Jisoo stayed in their assigned quarters, connected to the relays that Byul was planting. Each relay that went active gave her deeper access to the fortress's internal network. She moved through their systems like smoke through cracks, careful and slow, never touching anything that might trigger an alarm. She mapped the fortress layout. She found the communication logs. She found the patrol schedules for the fleet that guarded the station. She copied everything. On the second day of the summit, Dawan found the war room. It was located at the top of the central tower, behind a corridor that was guarded by 8 soldiers, and sealed with a door that did not respond to any normal access code. Jisoo scanned it remotely and confirmed what they had feared. It was a living gene lock. The door would only open for a specific set of Valari DNA signatures, all belonging to the highest-ranking commanders in the Empire. Dawan stood in that corridor, looking at that door, and felt the weight of what he was trying to do settle on his shoulders like stone. The war room was right there. Everything he needed was behind that door. The records, the schedules, the proof of every hunt, every raid, every life taken for sport. But the door would not open for him. Not like this. He needed a key. A living key. That night, Dawan returned to the summit hall and watched the crowd until he found what he was looking for. A tall Valari in golden armor stood near the center of the room, surrounded by officers who treated him with visible respect and fear. Jisoo identified him through the network. Commander Dokkan, head of the Hunt Division, the official who personally reviewed and approved every hunt that took place in Valari space. He was the one who signed the orders. He was the one who chose the targets. He was the one who had approved the hunt that killed Tejo. Dowan watched Dokkan laugh at something one of his officers said. He watched him drink and smile and move through the crowd like a man who had never once considered the possibility that the things he did might have consequences. Dowan memorized his face. He memorized his schedule. He memorized the way he moved and the routes he took through the fortress. Then he went back to his quarters and told his team that he had found their way in. They slaughtered his son for sport. Now he's inside their war room. Part 2. Old Debts. The station city of Hagen floated in a slow orbit around a gas giant that had no name worth remembering. It was the kind of place people came to when they wanted to disappear, or when they needed to find someone who already had. The docks were loud and crowded, and smelled like engine fuel and cooked meat, and the sharp chemical sting of recycled air. Ships came and went at all hours. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared about answers. Dowan arrived on a cargo shuttle that he had paid for with credits he kept in an account that did not have his real name on it. He had not used the account in 12 years, but the credits were still there. That was the thing about the kind of work he used to do. The money never expired, because the people who paid you never wanted a trail. He walked through the lower market with his bag over his shoulder, and his coat pulled tight around him. He looked like any other traveler, tired, quiet, unremarkable. That was the point. He had spent the best years of his life learning how to be invisible, and the skill had not left him even after all this time. The first person he needed to find was Jisoo. He found her in a signal den 3 levels below the main market, sitting in a dark room surrounded by floating screens and tangled cables that hung from the ceiling like vines. Jisoo was small and thin, with short hair and fingers that never stopped moving. She had been the best signals operator in the Republic's Black Ops division, a ghost who could crack any encryption, hijack any communication, and disappear from any network without leaving a trace. She had retired the same year Dowan had, and she had spent the years since selling her skills to smugglers and traders who needed someone to keep their communications private. She looked up when Dowan walked in, and her face changed in a way that told him she already knew why he was there. "I saw the broadcast," she said quietly. Dowan sat down across from her. He did not waste time with greetings or small talk. He told her what he wanted. Not revenge, not a strike on the arena. He wanted the war room, the Valari High Command's orbital fortress, where every hunt was planned, approved, and scheduled. The place where the nobles sat in comfortable chairs and decided which species would be taken next and how many would die for their entertainment. Jisoo stared at him for a long time. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, "You are out of your mind." Dowan said nothing. Jisoo rubbed her face with both hands. She pulled up a screen and began typing. After a few minutes, she turned the screen toward him. It showed a massive structure floating in orbit above the Valari homeworld. A fortress the size of a small moon, covered in weapon platforms and surrounded by a patrol fleet that never slept. The war room was at its center, buried behind layers of security that included gene-locked doors, neural scanning fields, and enough armed soldiers to fight a small war. "This is what you want to walk into," she said. "Alone?" "Not alone," Dowan said. "I need you, and I need Biol." Jisoo closed her eyes and let out a long breath. "Biol is going to love this." They found Biol 2 levels up in a workshop that was half weapons store and half medical clinic. She was a tall woman with strong arms and steady hands, and a scar that ran from her left ear to her chin. She had been a combat medic in the same unit as Dowan and Jisoo, and she had saved both their lives more than once during missions that the Republic would deny ever happened. After she left the service, she had turned to selling weapons and medical supplies to people who could not get them through legal channels. She was good at it. She was good at most things. Dawan told her the plan. Bial listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, a wide, sharp smile that Dawan remembered from the old days, the smile she wore right before things got dangerous. "I was getting bored anyway," she said. They needed one more person, a pilot who knew the Valari trade lanes well enough to get them past the border patrols without being flagged. Jisoo knew someone. His name was Hanul, and he ran a small smuggling operation out of the lower docks. He was young, maybe 30, with quick eyes and a nervous energy that made him look like he was always about to run. But Jisoo said he was the best pilot she had ever seen, and Jisoo did not say things like that lightly. Hanul was not easy to convince. He sat in the cockpit of his battered cargo ship and listened to the plan with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. When Dawan finished, Hanul shook his head. "You want to fly into Valari space, dock at their most heavily defended fortress, and walk into their high command," he said. "That is not a plan. That is a death wish." "I will pay you enough to buy a new ship," Dawan said. 3 new ships." Hanul looked at him. "It is not about the money." "Then what is it about?" Hanul was quiet for a moment, with a screen on his console, and showed Dawan a photograph. It was a girl, maybe 16 or 17, with a round face and dark eyes. "My sister. The Valari took her 2 years ago during a raid on a transport ship. I never found out what happened to her. I never saw a broadcast. She just vanished." He paused. "If you are really going inside that fortress, I want to look at their records. I want to know what they did with her." Dawan nodded. "You will have access to everything." The 4 of them began working that same night. Jisoo set up a secure communications array and started intercepting Valari signals, patrol schedules, shipping routes, coded messages between commanders. Bial sourced equipment, weapons, medical supplies, signal relays small enough to hide in clothing. Hanul studied the trade lanes, mapping every checkpoint and patrol rotation between Hagun and Valari space. Dawan sat in the center of it all and planned. He was patient. It was the thing that had made him good at his old job. Not speed, not strength, but the ability to wait and watch, and move only when the moment was exactly right. Over the next 3 weeks, a picture began to form. Jisoo found something in the intercepted communications. A diplomatic summit was being held aboard the War Room Fortress in 30 days. Trade delegations from a dozen species would be welcomed aboard with reduced security screening. It was a rare opening, a crack in the wall, just wide enough for a small team to slip through. Dawan looked at the data. He looked at his team. Jisoo was already building forged credentials. Biol was testing the signal relays. Hanul was plotting a course through Valari space that used dead zones in their patrol coverage. None of them talked about the odds. None of them talked about what would happen if they were caught. They had all been in this kind of situation before, a long time ago, when they were younger, and the Republic told them where to go and what to do. This time, nobody was giving orders. This time, it was personal. Dawan thought about Taeho every night. He did not dream about the broadcast. He dreamed about older things. Taeho as a child, running through the fields near their house, laughing at something Dawan could never quite hear. He dreamed about teaching the boy to fix engines and read star charts. He dreamed about the last time he saw his son's face, not on a screen in an arena, but in the doorway of their home, smiling and waving and saying he would be back before winter. He held on to that image. They slaughtered his son for sport. Now he's inside their war room. Part 1. The Hunt. The signal came through at midnight on a cold evening, and it arrived on every screen in the relay station like a disease spreading through blood. Dawan was sitting alone in the back room of his small house on the edge of the frontier colony when the broadcast flickered to life on his old monitor. He had been cleaning a rifle that he no longer used. The weapon was a habit, not a tool. He kept it the way some men kept photographs of places they would never visit again. The broadcast was loud and bright and ugly. It opened with a roaring crowd, thousands of Valari packed into a stone arena that floated somewhere in high orbit, above a world Darwin did not recognize. The Valari were tall creatures, scaled and sharp-jawed, with forearms and eyes like cracked glass. They moved with the easy confidence of predators who had never once been prey. Their empires stretched across 9 systems and had been built on one simple idea: that strength was the only law worth following, and that weaker species existed for their amusement. Darwin almost turned it off. He had seen these broadcasts before. Everyone had. The Valari hunted other species for sport and filmed the whole thing for entertainment. They called it the offering. Every cycle, they raided frontier worlds and took captives, men, women, sometimes children, and dropped them into massive arenas where armed Valari nobles chased them down like animals. The galaxy knew about it. The Republic condemned it in official statements, but nobody did anything, because the Valari were powerful and their fleet was enormous and war was expensive. Darwin reached for the switch to kill the feed. Then the camera turned to the arena floor, and his hand stopped in the air. The boy standing in the dirt below the screaming crowd was tall and thin, with messy black hair and a torn jacket that Darwin recognized because he had bought it for him 3 months ago on his birthday. The boy's name was Tejo. He was 22 years old. He had left the colony 6 weeks ago to work on a supply freighter that ran cargo between the outer settlements. He had told his father he would be back before the winter season. He had smiled when he said it. Now Tejo stood in the middle of a killing floor, surrounded by Valari hunters who circled him like wolves around a wounded deer. His face was bruised. His left arm hung at a bad angle, but he was standing. He was still standing. Darwin did not breathe. He did not blink. He watched. The hunt began with a horn that echoed across the arena like a scream. He ran hard and fast, cutting between stone pillars and ducking under broken walls that had been placed in the arena to make the chase more interesting for the audience. The Valari hunters followed on foot, carrying long curved blades and laughing as they moved. They were not in a hurry. They never were. The hunt was not about catching the prey quickly. It was about making it last. Tejo fought. He picked up a rock and threw it at the first hunter who came close, catching the creature across the jaw. The crowd roared with delight. The Valari loved it when the prey fought back. It made the kill more satisfying. The hunter Tejo had struck barely flinched. He stepped forward and slashed Tejo across the ribs with a blade that moved so fast Darwin almost missed it on the screen. Tejo stumbled, but did not fall. He backed into a corner and raised his fists, blood running down his side. 3 hunters closed in. Tejo swung at the first one, missed. The second one hit him across the back of the legs, and he dropped to his knees. The third one grabbed him by the hair and pulled his head back. The crowd was chanting now. The camera zoomed in close on Tejo's face. His eyes were wide and scared, but his jaw was set hard, and he did not beg. He did not scream. He looked straight into the camera, and for one terrible second, Darwin felt like his son was looking directly at him. The killing blow came from behind. A Valari noble, dressed in golden armor and carrying a ceremonial blade, stepped forward and drove the weapon through Tejo's chest. The crowd erupted. Fireworks burst above the arena. Music played. The noble raised his blade and bowed to the audience, while Tejo's body fell forward into the dirt. Darwin stared at the screen. The broadcast continued. Replays, commentary, scores. The world around him had gone very quiet, the way it does when something breaks inside a person so completely that the sound itself seems to leave the room. He sat there for a long time. Minutes, maybe hours. The monitor light flickered across his face, and he did not move. Then he stood up. He walked to the far corner of the room, where the floor panels were slightly uneven. He knelt down and pulled one of the panels free, revealing a narrow space beneath. Inside the space was a long metal case covered in dust. He had not touched it in 12 years. He pulled it out and laid it on the table and opened it. Inside was a neural cloak suit, black, thin, folded tight like a second skin. Beside it was a short-range signal scrambler, a set of forged identity chips, and a small data card that held the names and contact codes of people he had not spoken to in over a decade. People from his old life, the life he had lived before the colony, before Yuna, before Tejo. The life where his job title was classified and his missions did not officially exist. Darwin touched the suit with his fingertips. The material was cool and familiar. Behind him, the door opened. Yuna stood in the doorway. She was a small woman, with steady eyes, and gray in her hair that had not been there 5 years ago. She looked at the case on the table. She looked at her husband's face. She had been married to him long enough to know what that expression meant. She had seen it once before, a long time ago, on the night he had come home from a mission covered in blood that was not his own, and told her he was done with that world forever. She did not ask him what he was going to do. She did not try to stop him. She walked to the closet, pulled out his heavy coat, and held it out to him. Darwin took it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he packed the case, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out into the cold night air, without saying a word. The stars above the colony were bright and endless, and somewhere out there, beyond the dark, was a fortress full of monsters who thought they were untouchable. He was going to show them how wrong they were.